Power isn't tested in moments of control. It's tested in the silence before the storm. And Clara Whitmore had spent years perfecting that silence. She was the kind of woman people admired without ever really seeing. Always gracious, always composed. She didn't chase attention. She directed it quietly, like a conductor shaping music in a hall full of noise. For 15 years, she played the perfect wife to Nathan Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Holdings, a man who spoke like every word was a press release and moved through life like a king with no need to look back. To most, Clara seemed content with that role. She planned the family dinners, smiled through the board events, knew the names of every board member's spouse and their allergies. To everyone else, she was a supporting character in Nathan's empire. But what they didn't know, what Nathan never thought to ask, was that Clara had been watching, learning, preparing. The night of the annual Whitmore family dinner arrived like a dress rehearsal for perfection. The 58th floor of the Whitmore Crown Plaza gleamed in polished glass and silverware. Waiters in black vests moved like shadows. Every detail had been arranged by Clara down to the exact temperature, 72 degrees. Nathan hated being too warm during business conversations. Her midnight blue gown fit with quiet elegance. Her diamond earrings sparkled without needing to shout. Their daughter, Isabel, walked in with the poise of a woman twice her age. Julian followed. A quiet storm in a tailored suit, his gaze always scanning, always thoughtful. Clara's children had learned early how to walk in rooms built by other people's pride. Clara moved through the space with precision, greeting guests like a conductor cueing her orchestra. Everything was in place, except Nathan. He was late. Margaret Whitmore, Nathan's mother, swept in next. Regal, sharp, and still commanding at 76, she took one glance at the empty chair at the head of the table and clicked her tongue. "Let me guess. My son is late to his own dinner. Again." Clara's smile didn't falter. "You mentioned a last-minute meeting." Margaret gave a thin, dry nod. Charles was never late a day in his life. Punctuality is respect, and respect is the foundation of business. "I suppose we all have our methods," Clara replied softly. Margaret studied her for a moment, then patted her hand with unexpected gentleness. "Indeed we do, my dear. Indeed we do." By 7:20, the room was full. 14 people sat around the long dining table. Only 2 seats remained empty, the head of the table and one other. Then, as if cued by some silent stage manager, the double doors opened. Nathan Whitmore had arrived, and he wasn't alone. "Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The room didn't fall silent, it froze. Every eye turned toward the doorway where Nathan stood tall and polished, exactly as expected. His tailored navy suit, his confident stride, that performative smile he always wore at these events. But what captured the room wasn't him. It was her. A woman, no more than 28, stunning in a form-fitting red dress that shimmered like a warning. Her long black hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her features were delicate, almost too perfect. But it wasn't just her presence that halted the air. It was her belly. 5, maybe 6 months pregnant, and she was holding onto Nathan's arm like she belonged there. "Good evening, everyone," Nathan said, his voice full of practiced ease. "Apologies for the delay. I'd like to introduce Naomi Lin, our new director of special projects for the Asian markets." The words hung in the air, carefully chosen, obviously rehearsed. He knew what he was doing. He looked directly at Clara as he delivered the next blow, the smile at the corner of his mouth curling with satisfaction. "And the mother of my son, the next heir to Whitmore Holdings." No one moved. The chandelier lights flickered slightly. The only sound was the soft clink of someone's fork being set down a little too quickly. Across the table, Isabel's lips parted, her expression unreadable. Julian's jaw tightened, but he remained still. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she took in the scene without a word. "And Clara?" Clara rose from her chair, every movement fluid, controlled. She walked toward the couple, her heels clicking gently against the marble floor, her face calm. Not stiff, not forced, just unreadable. She extended her hand toward Naomi, who looked like she might either faint or run. "Welcome to our family dinner, Miss Lin," Clara said, her voice smooth as velvet. "Please, sit here next to me. That's the honored guest's seat." Naomi hesitated, her eyes darting to Nathan, then back to Clara. Slowly, she reached out and took Clara's hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. That's very kind." Nathan stood awkwardly, unsure whether to follow. His expression faltered. This wasn't the explosion he had scripted. No gasps, no glass shattering, no scene. Just Clara, setting the table like a queen who'd already won the war before her opponent knew it had started. The servers, still stunned near the wall, began to move again. "We can begin now," Clara said gently. "And please, bring Mr. Whitmore his preferred Bordeaux." Nathan finally took his seat at the head of the table. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid. Naomi sat beside Clara, her posture still stiff, unsure whether she was a guest or a grenade. Across the room, Margaret watched Clara with a look she hadn't worn in years, something between disbelief and admiration. "You said she'd be upset," Naomi whispered to Nathan, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "She's just in shock," he muttered, barely moving his lips. "It'll hit her later." But it wasn't Clara who looked shaken. It was him, because everything he'd counted on, humiliation, chaos, control, was slipping. And Clara? Clara was just getting started. Clara turned slightly toward Naomi, her voice soft but steady. "Tell me more about your background," she said, reaching for her water. "How did you come to join Whitmore Holdings?" The entire table perked up, unsure if they were still in a corporate dinner or some high-stakes play. But Naomi, to her credit, straightened her spine. Something about Clara's calm presence had shifted her discomfort into a kind of quiet courage. "I have a background in international market development," Naomi began, her tone professional. "I focused on the intersection of Western luxury branding and Eastern consumer behavior during my time at Harvard Business School. My thesis was on cultural integration in expanding hospitality chains." Clara nodded slowly, never breaking eye contact. "Impressive." Around the table, heads tilted. The board members, initially too stunned by the drama, now leaned in, not to gossip, but to listen. Because Naomi wasn't just a pretty face. She was sharp, articulate, strategic. "I first met Mr. Whitmore," Naomi continued, carefully choosing her words, "during a conference in Singapore. We discussed market entry failures in Shanghai, and he later invited me to consult. That evolved into a more permanent role." Nathan, who had been sipping his wine too quickly, cleared his throat. "Naomi has been instrumental in shaping our new Pacific strategy. She's uniquely positioned to lead our entry into the Chinese market." Clara tilted her head. "Franklin," she said, turning to the board chairman, "didn't you raise concerns last quarter about our lack of cultural differentiation in Asia?" Franklin shifted in his chair, surprised to be addressed so directly. "Yes, I did. We were seeing stagnant projections in the preliminary assessments." Naomi, without missing a beat, spoke again. "The differentiator is respect. You can't just replicate Western luxury and expect Chinese consumers to embrace it. They want integration, not appropriation." Another pause settled over the room, a thoughtful one this time. Even Margaret looked up, her expression unreadable but alert. Nathan forced a smile, clearly trying to steer the room back under his control. "Exactly why I recruited Naomi. She's not just experienced, she's visionary." Clara raised her glass, studying Naomi with a measured gaze. "How long have you been with the company, Naomi?" Naomi blinked. "Almost 2 years now." "And when did your personal relationship with Mr. Whitmore begin?" The question landed like a pin drop in a cathedral. Every sound ceased. Even the servers stopped mid-step. Nathan gripped his glass harder. "Clara, perhaps this isn't—" "No," Naomi said quietly, interrupting him. "It's all right." She took a breath and looked Clara in the eyes. "About 14 months ago." Clara nodded slowly. "Thank you for your honesty." There was no trace of sarcasm in her voice, no tremble, no rage. Just clarity, steady and unnerving. Nathan, visibly agitated, leaned forward. "This is turning into a personal ambush." Clara placed her glass down with precision. "Not at all. I simply believe that if we're going to reconfigure the future of this family and this company, the facts should be transparent, especially when the proposed heir is seated at this table." Naomi shrank slightly, her hand resting instinctively on her stomach. Across the room, Isabel and Julian sat still, no outbursts, no visible tension. But something simmered beneath their composed expressions. And Nathan? He finally began to realize that the dinner he had planned, the performance he had orchestrated to dominate the room, was no longer his to control. Clara was hosting now, and the rules had changed. Clara stood up slowly, the room still frozen from Nathan's bombshell, but her movements were calm, almost rehearsed. She stepped around the long table, heels clicking lightly against the polished marble floor. Her face betrayed nothing, no shock, no sadness, no rage, only grace. When she reached Nathan and Naomi, she didn't look at him. Her gaze settled directly on the younger woman beside him, and for a second, the room seemed to collectively inhale. Clara extended her hand, not to her husband, but to Naomi. "Welcome to our family dinner, Miss Lynn," she said, her voice even, composed. "We usually reserve the seat beside me for our guest of honor. I'd like you to have it." Naomi's eyes widened, caught off guard. She looked briefly at Nathan, then back at Clara. The tension in the air felt almost unbearable. After a long pause, Naomi placed her hand in Clara's. "Thank you," she whispered. Clara nodded gently and led her through the room. Chairs scraped as diners shifted, uncertain what to make of the unfolding scene. Nathan followed a step behind, his jaw tight, like he was trying to calculate how the narrative had slipped from his control. When they reached the table, Clara pulled out the chair next to hers and gestured for Naomi to sit. Then she returned to her own seat and reached for the water pitcher. With the same elegance that had hosted heads of state and billion-dollar investors, Clara poured Naomi a glass, then her own. She turned slightly, offering a small, kind smile. "We believe every guest should feel seen." Nathan slowly sank into his chair at the head of the table, expression unreadable. But his shoulders had stiffened. This wasn't the scene he had pictured. Not by a long shot. Across the table, Isabel and Julian watched with matching expressions of wary curiosity. Margaret, the family matriarch, lifted her wine glass and studied Clara over the rim, her eyes sharp. Then Clara spoke again, turning to Naomi as if nothing had happened. "I understand you lead our special projects division in Asia. I'd love to hear more about the cultural integration strategies you've been exploring." Naomi blinked. I'd be honored." And just like that, the storm Nathan had meant to unleash turned into a business discussion, elegant, measured, and under Clara's full control. Nathan reached for his wine, hand trembling slightly. This dinner was no longer his performance, it was Clara's. The first course was served. Crystal clinked softly as the servers moved with trained precision, setting down plates of delicate roasted beets and whipped goat cheese. But no one was really paying attention to the food. All eyes, discreet or not, lingered between the three people seated at the center of the long table: Clara, Naomi, and Nathan. Clara cut into her salad gracefully. "So, Miss Lynn," she said without looking up, "how long have you been working with Whitmore Holdings?" Naomi hesitated, her fork hovering. "Almost 2 years now. I started as a consultant for the Shanghai expansion, then transitioned into a full-time role last year." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "You came in right around the time Nathan began championing the push into the Pacific Rim. That was a bold move." Nathan cleared his throat, reaching for his wine. "It was a strategic necessity." Clara turned to him then, her voice still pleasant. "Of course, and I assume you've briefed the board thoroughly on the structure of the new subsidiary?" A beat of silence. Franklin Miles, the chairman, looked up from his plate. "New subsidiary?" Clara let out a quiet hum of acknowledgement. "Whitmore Pacific, wasn't it, Nathan? You mentioned it in passing." Nathan's eyes darkened. "We're still in early stages, nothing formal to present yet." Clara smiled. That's odd, because I came across quite a few formal documents, registered entities, ownership declarations, even asset transfers." Naomi's hand froze mid-motion. Her eyes flicked to Nathan. Franklin shifted in his seat, lips thinning. "Nathan, is there a new entity already registered?" Nathan forced a laugh. "Let's not derail the dinner with business minutiae." But Clara wasn't done. "I agree," she said, placing her fork down neatly. "Tonight is about family, which is why I think it's the perfect time to discuss the next generation." She turned her gaze to Naomi, gentle but unblinking. "You mentioned earlier that you're carrying the future heir to Whitmore Holdings. I'm curious, what does that mean for my children?" The question fell like a stone into water. Ripples of discomfort spread around the table. Isabel's hand clenched subtly around her wine glass. Julian's eyes narrowed. Nathan leaned forward, his tone suddenly sharp. "Clara, this isn't the time or place." "I disagree," she interrupted calmly. "You introduced Naomi tonight not just as a colleague, but as the mother of your heir. That's not a minor announcement. And since we are, as you've always said, a family business, I think it's fair we all understand the implications." Naomi looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Nathan glanced around the table, reading the room, realizing, perhaps too late, that the performance was no longer under his direction. "Isabel and Julian will always be part of this company," he said firmly. "But they've shown little interest in leadership so far. This child," he gestured vaguely toward Naomi, "represents a new chapter." Clara tilted her head slightly. "You mean a replacement?" Nathan's jaw clenched. Franklin Miles broke the tension with a forced cough. "Let's not make assumptions. Any structural changes would need board review." "Of course," Clara said smoothly. "And while we're on the topic of structure, I'd be happy to share some documents I found while reviewing our joint holdings." Nathan stiffened. "You've been reviewing our holdings?" he asked. Clara turned to him, the warmth never leaving her voice. "For months, actually." And just like that, a current shifted beneath the table. Quiet but unmistakable. For the first time in years, Nathan looked uncertain. And across the table, Julian sat a little straighter. Isabel's cold expression melted into something closer to curiosity. Margaret lifted her wine, but her eyes were laser-focused on Clara. Naomi said nothing, but the way she sat, tensely, uncomfortably, as if something had just cracked inside her, said everything. Clara lifted her glass toward the group. "To family," she said with a small smile. The toast hung in the air like a challenge. To what family would remain after tonight? No one raised their glass. At least, not right away. Margaret was the first, her voice soft but firm. "To family," she echoed. Then, like dominoes, others followed, some out of politeness, some out of pressure, and a few with real curiosity, wondering what Clara Whitmore was about to do next. Dinner resumed. Conversation, however, did not. Nathan tried. He made a few light-hearted remarks about the Shanghai development, tossed in a joke about Julian still being allergic to boardrooms, but none of it landed. And then dessert was served. Chef Pascal's signature dark chocolate soufflé arrived, still warm, the center molten and perfect. The staff stepped back. This was usually the highlight of the evening, but not tonight. Because Clara didn't pick up her spoon, she reached instead for her handbag, set carefully by her chair, and retrieved a slim silver case. The entire table seemed to hold its breath. She placed it gently on the linen cloth, unlatched it. From inside, she pulled a single folded document, thick paper, embossed seal, crisp edges. Nathan froze. "What is that?" he asked. Clara didn't look at him. She looked at Franklin Miles. "The original trust agreement, drafted by Charles Whitmore 15 years ago. It outlines control and voting rights over Whitmore holdings in the event of a leadership dispute or misconduct." Franklin blinked. "I thought that document was sealed." "It was," Clara said, her tone still perfectly calm, "until Charles had it unsealed before he passed and sent me a copy." Nathan leaned forward, his voice low. "You're bluffing." Clara finally turned to him. "Am I?" She slid the document toward Franklin. He opened it slowly, adjusting his glasses, scanning the contents. As he read, the blood drained from his face. This grants control and interest to the spouse of the sitting CEO," Franklin said slowly. 57% of voting shares held in trust transferable only through spousal relinquishment." Nathan's jaw tightened. That was symbolic. It was never meant to be. It was binding. Clara cut in. "And you've exercised authority all these years as my proxy, with my signature." Franklin looked up. "That's true. I've seen those proxy documents myself, signed by Clara." Nathan turned to his mother. "Did you know about this?" Margaret's expression was unreadable. "Charles never did anything halfway." Then she added, "And you were warned, Nathan, about overreaching." He stood abruptly, palms flat on the table. "This is a setup." Clara didn't even flinch. "It's a reckoning," she said softly, "for every quiet meeting I was excluded from, every decision you made assuming I wasn't watching, every dollar you moved offshore, thinking no one would trace it." The room was silent again. Except for Naomi, she spoke, her voice small. "Offshore?" Clara turned to her gently. "Singapore, Cayman Islands, 3 shell companies, all in Nathan's name. Not the company's, not yours, just his." Naomi looked at Nathan. "You told me you were protecting us, that all of it was for our son's future." He didn't answer. He couldn't. Clara leaned forward, but her voice was kind. "You weren't the only one deceived, Naomi. But now that you know, you can decide what future you want for your child." Nathan's face was a mask of fury. You think you can just take everything from me? Clara's gaze didn't waver. I already have, Nathan. I've just been patient. And then she did the unthinkable. She turned to the staff. Could you please bring in the portfolios? The doors opened. 2 assistants entered, each carrying a stack of leather-bound folders, one for every board member. Clara stood as the portfolios were distributed. These contain the full forensic audit, confirming the misappropriation of company assets, she said calmly. Backed by independent analysts, legal verification, and signed statements from our partners in Singapore. Nathan's voice cracked as he tried to speak. This is madness. But no one was looking at him anymore. They were looking at Clara, and for the first time, truly seeing her. Not the CEO's wife, not the hostess, but the strategist, the executor, the heir, the woman who had let her husband believe he was in control until it was time to take back what had always been hers. Nathan didn't sit down. He couldn't. He stood there, frozen, fists clenched at his sides, eyes darting from board member to board member. Watching them flip through the audit files, watching their brows furrow, watching decades of control crumble right beneath his perfectly polished shoes. David Chen, the company's general counsel, stood quietly at the far end of the room. He'd remained silent through most of dinner, until now. I'd like to confirm, he said, that the financial records provided by Mrs. Whitmore were reviewed and authenticated by 3 separate firms, including the board-approved auditor. He paused. And based on the evidence, I've advised immediate termination proceedings in accordance with Article 7 of the Whitmore Holdings Charter. Nathan's face twisted. You're my legal counsel. David didn't flinch. No, I'm counsel to Whitmore Holdings. My duty is to the company, not to you. Nathan turned to Franklin, grasping for something, anything. Franklin, you can't seriously believe she's capable of running this place. Franklin looked at him, eyes tired. She already has, Nathan. You just didn't see it. I built this company. You inherited it, Clara said quietly, cutting him off, and almost dismantled it, for greed, for pride, for ego dressed up in pinstripes. Naomi sat motionless, her eyes wide, hands cradling her stomach like a shield. You lied to me, she said finally. All of it, about the company, about Clara, about your plans. Nathan reached toward her, desperate. I did it for us, for the baby. Naomi pulled away, her voice firm now. You did it for yourself. Clara stepped forward again, this time not with fire, but steel. Mr. Chen has prepared the termination documents. You'll receive a severance package consistent with executive policy. Provided, she added, you sign a full non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement. Nathan's laugh was bitter. And if I don't? David Chen's voice was calm. Then the audit will be turned over to federal investigators. The charges will include embezzlement, tax fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Estimated sentence, 15 to 20 years. Silence. Dead, suffocating silence. For the first time all evening, Nathan sat down, not out of choice but collapse. His shoulders slackened, his gaze fixed on nothing. He wasn't the CEO anymore. He was a man who had lost everything except the truth, and that truth was sitting directly across from him, in the form of the woman he once dismissed as irrelevant. And she had just destroyed him without ever raising her voice. Clara took a slow breath, then looked across the room to Naomi. You're welcome to remain in the penthouse during your pregnancy, she said softly. You'll find it more comfortable. If you need anything for the child, call me. Naomi's throat tightened. Why are you being kind to me? Because none of this was your doing, Clara answered. You were promised something that never truly existed, and you deserve the chance to build something real for your child. Naomi blinked, trying to hold back tears. Across the room, Isabel and Julian sat in still silence, staring at their father, then at their mother. The clarity in their eyes said it all. They had chosen their side, and they had chosen well. Clara turned to the board, standing tall but composed. I've called an emergency vote for 9 a.m. tomorrow, she said. The materials have been sent. This room will have a new CEO by the end of the meeting. But tonight? She looked at her children, at Naomi, and at the legacy now in her hands. Tonight, we begin again. Then she sat, calm as ever, and picked up her spoon. The chocolate soufflé was still warm. The next morning, the executive boardroom on the 53rd floor of Whitmore Holdings was filled with an energy that didn't quite match its usual luxury. It was sharper, tighter. Like the moment before a rocket lifts off the launch pad. At 8:59 a.m., the doors opened. Clara Whitmore stepped inside, not in the silk evening gowns she used to wear at fundraisers, but in a tailored graphite suit that whispered power without screaming it. A single sapphire brooch, Margaret's old heirloom, was pinned near her collarbone. Her stride was measured, her shoulders square, her eyes clear. She took her place at the head of the table. Not beside it, not behind it, at it. David Chen stood to her right, already handing out the final packets to board members. The forensic audit, the legal resolutions, the restructuring plan. Everything was ready. Franklin Miles gave a subtle nod from the far end, signaling the board was present and accounted for. Clara glanced once at the city skyline behind her, then back to the room. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm but utterly in command. "Let's begin." The vote took less than 5 minutes. Unanimous. No objections. Not even from Nathan's attorney, who sat stone-faced at the back, scribbling notes for a man who wasn't allowed within 100 feet of the premises anymore. When the final paper was signed, Franklin stood. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said formally, "congratulations, it is now official." Clara didn't smile. "Not yet. This isn't a celebration," she said. "It's a responsibility, and we've got work to do." She opened the first tab of her binder and launched straight into the recovery strategy. By 9:45, the transition plan was approved. By 10, legal had finalized the asset freezing orders. By 11:30, Clara had made personal calls to the company's top 5 international partners, not just to assure them, but to invite them in. They didn't hesitate. The market, sensing the shift, responded with confidence. By the end of the day, Whitmore Holdings stock had not only stabilized, it rose. But Clara wasn't looking at the numbers. She was looking at the faces around the table. The board members who once thought of her as nothing more than Nathan's elegant wife were now asking her questions, listening when she spoke, taking notes. At one point, Victoria Gia leaned over to David Chen and whispered, "She doesn't just lead, she rewrites the air in the room." He nodded. "She was doing it all along, we just didn't see it." At 12:30, Clara stepped into her new office. It had once been Nathan's. Now, it was hers. Gone were the brooding portraits of Whitmore men. In their place were renderings of future hotels, modern, sustainable, inclusive. A clean desk, a simple orchid near the window, a photograph of Isabel and Julian from a family hike, not a corporate gala. Jennifer, now chief of staff, stepped in with a fresh pot of tea. "How do you take it, Mrs. Whitmore?" Clara looked up and smiled, not out of formality, but recognition. "You already know." Jennifer returned the smile. "Always have." As the day wore on, messages poured in, from former colleagues, from clients, from women she'd mentored in private. Some sent congratulations, some sent apologies, most sent gratitude, but one message stood out. It was from Naomi. Just 3 words, "He knows now." Clara stared at the message, then closed her phone. There was no glee in her expression. No triumph, only peace. And the weight of leadership settling, not as a burden, but as a mantle she had always been meant to carry. Outside the windows, Atlanta glittered in the afternoon light, but Clara Whitmore no longer needed reflections of power. She had become the source of it. 3 months later, the Whitmore Grand Hotel gleamed in the Atlanta skyline, not as a fortress of male legacy, but as a beacon of something reborn. The portraits of Charles and Nathan no longer lined the entrance. In their place were pieces from local women artists, color, story, life. On the 62nd floor, the presidential suite had been renamed, the Whitmore Legacy Suite. That night, Clara hosted a small gathering. Not a gala, not a press event, just the people who mattered. Julian was near the windows, talking animatedly with Victoria Gia about the new sustainability framework for their Asian division. His eyes lit up when he spoke, not with ambition but purpose. Isabel stood by the art wall, showing Naomi ultrasound photos of her baby boy. The way she laughed, relaxed and radiant, was a glimpse of the woman Clara had always known her daughter could be. Once free of the silent war at home, Naomi looked different too. Not just because she was now 8 months along, but because she carried herself like a woman who no longer walked in someone else's shadow. Her maternity dress was sleek, professional, her posture upright, her gaze steady. She was no longer the mistress. She was a partner, a mother, a survivor. And Clara? She stood quietly by the tall windows, a glass of water in hand, watching the city she had once viewed from the margins. Now, it looked back at her like it had always been waiting for her. Margaret stepped beside her, her silver hair perfectly set, her presence still commanding, but now softened with pride. He would have been proud, she said. Clara didn't ask who, she knew. Charles didn't just build a company, Margaret continued. He built a maze. And you, my dear, were the only one patient enough to find your way through it. Clara smiled. I didn't just want to survive it, she said softly. I wanted to rebuild it, from the ground up, not as a kingdom, but a table. Margaret chuckled. A table? Clara nodded. One where everyone has a seat, earned, not inherited, built on trust, not control, and no one gets thrown out just because they speak the truth. As if on cue, Naomi approached with Isabel and Julian. We're about to announce the new education fund, Julian said, excitement in his voice. Named after Grandpa Charles, but designed by us. And funded by Whitmore Legacy Trust, Isabel added. We're doing it differently this time. Clara nodded. That's the point. Better doesn't come from pretending the past didn't happen. It comes from making sure it never happens again. Naomi stepped forward, placing a hand gently over her belly. He's going to grow up in a world you helped change, she said. Not just for him, but for all of us. Clara met her gaze, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but a deeper form of peace. The kind that grows in shared soil. Across the room, Franklin Miles raised a glass. To the future of Whitmore Holdings, he said. But it was Margaret who added the final line. And to the woman who reminded us all that silence isn't weakness. It's a strategy, until the moment it becomes your sword. There was no fanfare, no standing ovation, just a quiet, shared understanding that something rare had happened. Not a revolution, but a revelation. And Clara Whitmore, once underestimated, once unseen, now stood at the helm of an empire built not on inheritance, but integrity. A matriarchy not born from vengeance, but vision. This story reminds us that true power isn't loud, it's earned through patience, clarity, and quiet strength. Clara didn't fight with chaos, she led with wisdom. In a world that often underestimates women, she showed that dignity and strategy can win against betrayal. What about you? Did Clara's journey resonate with you? Drop a 2 in the comments if you loved her silent revenge, or a 7 if it didn't land for you. And if stories like this inspire or move you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one.